Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Matthew Pettway. I'm the author of Cuban Literature in the Age of Black Insurrection, and it's an honor to be part of the 25th African Atlantic Research Team Symposium. I am Assistant Professor of Spanish at the University of South Alabama. My lecture this evening will explore how Juan Francisco Manzano, a Cuban Frederick Douglass of sorts, and Gabriel de la Concepcion Valdez, akin to Martin Delany in the United States, use African ideas of spirit and cosmos as a means to emancipation. Cuban literature in the age of Black insurrection, Manzano, Palacio, and Afro-Latino religion represents a paradigm shift in the field of Latin American studies in several ways. It is the first book-length study of the most important writers of African descent in colonial Spanish America, Juan Francisco Manzano, a Cuban Frederick Douglass, and Gabriel de la Concepcion Valdez, also known as Plácido, who was similar to Martin Delany. Critics often regard Manzano and Plácido as assimilationists that divorce themselves from African culture as a necessary concession to the white Catholic establishment in Cuba. But my book, Cuban Literature in the Age of Black Insurrection, is an exception to the rule because it claims that these Black authors did not fully assimilate to Spanish Catholicism. Rather, they appealed to African-inspired spirituality as a source of knowledge and a means to sacred authority. Plácido and Manzano were not mere imitators, but rather aesthetic and political pioneers. Finally, by reworking theories of transculturation from the angle of African religious epistemology, I seek to demonstrate that some of the processes of social transformation that cultural anthropologists David Brown, Stephen Palme, and Ivor Miller have examined in Cuba were also at work in literature in ways heretofore unknown. Cuban literature in the age of Black insurrection makes a compelling argument that Manzano and Plácido portrayed African-inspired spirituality beneath the surface of Hispano-Catholic text, which in effect transformed early Cuban literature into an instrument of Black liberation. African religious knowledge subverted Catholic dogma about redemptive suffering that might free the soul but leave the body enchained. It was Bakongo, West Central African, and Yoruba-inspired spiritualities, Yoruba being from West Africa, not the constraints of Catholic doctrine, that afforded Plácido and Manzano the political and metaphysical instruments to envision what African-descended liberation might become. Manzano and Plácido possessed dual cultural literacies, and they displayed a sense of simultaneity in their relationship with the Catholic Church and Black ritual communities. They negotiated religious meaning and claimed membership in both places at the same time, but they were not ambivalent about the epistemological value of their African religious heritage. These images here will allow us to imagine much more clearly the influence of Spanish Catholicism, since it was the official religion of the Spanish colony, as well as West Central African ideas of spirit and cosmos. This is an example of the Congolese cosmogram, which I will briefly reference today. Manzano was the first Cuban to publish a book of poetry in 1821. What is more, he became the only Afro-Latin American known to have authored a slave narrative in nearly 4 centuries of Spanish domination. His autobiography became the cornerstone of an emerging Cuban narrative tradition. Thus, the genesis of Cuban literature is a critical examination of the master-slave, enslaver-enslaved relationship. Though Plácido did not publish until 1834, more than 10 years after his counterpart Manzano, he became the most prolific poet and renowned improvisator throughout the island. There is no other Cuban poet, Black or white, that published more than Plácido in the 19th century. In nearly 10 years, he wrote, extemporized, and published nearly 700 poems and disseminated them in several compilations in newspapers throughout the island. But Plácido and Manzano produced literature in the shadow of the Haitian Revolution, which was between 1791 and 1804, when Haiti became the first Black nation in the hemisphere, where a successful African military campaign against French forces greatly influenced the manner in which the Spanish government sought to preserve the white supremacist order. I want to briefly discuss the obfuscation of African-inspired spirituality under the pressures of Spanish censorship. The Spanish regime struggled to govern the symbolic order by establishing Catholicism as the official religion, by instituting racial hierarchy, and through the censorship of all printed materials. The colonial government defined what constituted permissible speech and canonical doctrines, and they granted legitimacy to pro-slavery viewpoints while rejecting anti-slavery philosophy as inadmissible, sacrilegious, or even treasonous. Manzano and Plácido could not set the terms of debate. They produced literature under duress, and they navigated a political environment that demanded cultural homogeneity. As the late philosopher Michel Foucault wrote, institutions and academic disciplines create, quote, rules of exclusion, end quote, to control, select, organize, and redistribute language that enables them to govern what constitutes knowledge and to determine the methods of its production. Scholars can analyze the entanglement of Catholic symbols and African cosmologies in Plácido's and Manzano's work if we examine the unorthodox religious practices within their literature that the church would have deemed superstitious. Though superstition, quote unquote, was pervasive among Blacks and whites in late colonial Cuba, Catholics and Protestants often racialized the discourse on superstition, making it the primary domain of Black and Indigenous peoples. The church defines superstition or hechicería as an aberration of otherwise customary religious practices. Superstition was either occasioned by ignorance of doctrine, or in the most egregious cases, it was the intentional product of deceit. Father Felix Varela of Cuba was a professor at the Colegio Seminario de San Carlos, and in 1822, he advocated for the abolition of slavery. In 1838, from exile in the United States, Varela argued in Cartas al Epidio that superstition represented a threat to the hegemony of the Catholic Church, and he condemned superstitious individuals as, quote, enemies of divine authority, who erected themselves as oracles, end quote. Varela believed that these enemies of divine authority were false prophets, and that's his exact quote, because the oracle constituted an alternative source of knowledge and sacred authority that the priesthood could not conceivably control. So that process of obfuscation can be seen in the ways in which Varela has the authority to define what is legitimate religious knowledge. He then obfuscates practices he does not understand and that threaten Catholic hegemony. All of this is important because the spiritual practices that Varela deemed superstitious, the belief in miraculous saints, the abundance of spirit apparitions, and premonitory dreams that predict the future, these forms of spirituality were the hallmark of Plácido's and Manzano's transculturated colonial literature. These rules of racial and religious exclusion required Plácido and Manzano to camouflage their true meaning by employing symbols such as the Virgin Mary, Catholic saints, Greco-Roman deities, and cultural euphemism to portray African ideas of spirit and cosmos. I posit transculturated colonial literature as a theoretical idea for enabling us to probe colonial Latin American literature. Transculturated colonial literature exists within an intervening space. It is situated on the periphery, yet palatable to a metropolitan readership. Plácido and Manzano understood that creative control was a proxy for political power. Thus, they did not envision emancipation through the lens of Catholic doctrine that extolled redemptive suffering as a means of salvation. Rather, they relied on African-inspired spirituality to procure the power necessary to liberate themselves. But colonial censorship forbade anyone to write against the Catholic faith, and the government monitored Black authors to prevent anti-slavery conspiracy that might bring the Haitian Revolution to Cuban shores. So Manzano and Plácido used ambiguity, subtlety, and misdirection. A few examples will suffice to make my point. Manzano's knowledge of Afro-Caribbean religious concepts is evident in his autobiography and a select number of his poems. I'll talk briefly about A Dream for My Second Brother. It was a product of intercultural contact between Catholicism, Romanticism, and an African theory of dreams. Manzano would have been familiar with Catholic doctrine about dreams. The Catholics argued that dreams could be divine or diabolical, but they did not trust laypersons to determine which type of dream they had had. Father Felix Varela regarded dreams and oneiromancers, or dream interpreters, as a threat to the universal authority of the Catholic Church. In Varela's formulation, Cuban oneiromancers were charlatans, promoting their economic and political interests by deciphering dreams. Once again, that obfuscation coming from the Catholic Church with regard to African-inspired practices. Manzano dedicated his 1838 poem to his younger brother, Florencio. In the poem, he emerged not only as a dreamer, but also as an interpreter of spiritual messages for his brother, something which is consistent with an African theory of dreams derived from the Congo-Angolan region. Within a Congolese theory of dreams, Manzano was not an oneiromancer with selfish ambitions, but rather Imbangudi Andozi. I'll repeat that Kikongo word, Imbangudi Andozi, whose sensitivity and awareness, quote unquote, empowered him to decipher the symbols within his dream. Within the dream, Manzano sprouted wings and took flight to escape the plantation. He then communed with the bones of his deceased parents in an Afro-Caribbean ritual. Subsequent to that ritual, Manzano returned to the plantation to rescue his brother from slavery. This image here will allow us to imagine Manzano in flight. He had multicolored wings. He escaped to the forested wilderness and monte in Cuban Spanish, which is the height of sacrality in the Congolese-inspired traditions in Cuba. And magical flight is also a part of African diasporic traditions throughout the Caribbean. The next and final text that I will discuss is a fable, una fábula, by Plácido. This poem is called The Little Devil or Diablito, a term that Plácido uses because it was common in Spanish America. But the actual name for this particular African carnival masquerade would be Ireme in Cuban Spanish. And so we have an image here of Ireme in dialogue with a white aristocratic woman and the enslaved African woman. And so this is Epiphany celebrations on January the 6th, I'll be talking briefly about. Plácido's fable Diablito, the Little Devil, is an exceptional example of ambiguity, subtlety, and double entendre. El Diablito is transculturated colonial literature because it transforms Epiphany, an annual celebration of the birth of Christ, into an expression of West African carnival. In this poem, Plácido introduced African religious brotherhoods known as cabildos that commanded public space on January 6th, parading pirouetting masked dancers through the streets with great provocation and symbolism. But he transformed an innocuous Christian festival into a staging ground for Black insurrection. The poem depicts the Epiphany festivities from divergent points of view. To white onlookers, Carnival was drunken revelry, but for Blacks, it encompassed concealed spiritual meaning. Carnival spectators distort and obfuscate the festival masquerader as a maleficent entity known as the devil within the Judeo-Christian worldview. Plácido was well aware of this distortion of West African spirituality as his poem bears out, quote, "But as each one, with their eyes fixed and through different prisms viewed the objects, not one was observed the same by all, and so inequality was a true type," end quote. Cuban scholar Don Fernando Ortiz provides insight into this misnaming. He explains that white Catholics thought that the motley disguises, the leaps, all of this of the African masquerades simulated representations of the devil from the Corpus Christi procession in Cuba. Said differently, white onlookers misrecognized the African masquerade known as the Abacuá Ireme. Abacuá is the name of the male initiation society that parades this particular African masquerade. The African masquerade mocks unsuspecting bystanders that derisively chuckle, caught unawares that he has come to impose the law upon them, as the poem demonstrates, quote, "Nevertheless, there are always unforeseen events, and that day it happened to be the 6th of January, or so it said. An unforeseen object came to impose the law upon them, it was a little devil dancing in front of his cabildo, end quote. The masquerade's authority to invert the social order is not derived from the colonial regime, but exists in spite of it. Ireme is an envoy of the other world that embodies ancestral spirits and, quote, end quote, mythological characters, and leads his cabildo in the procession. Ireme, the leader of cabildo processions, conducted and executed purifications to send away evil influences that inhabited the physical world. The slave society was imbued with evil influence, such as racial hierarchy. The costume was integral to Ireme's performance. It was typically colorful, highly textured, and made of various materials to resemble the leopard. The leopard was emblematic of the virility and deftness of Abakwa masculinity, a Black fraternal society whose epistemological foundations are grounded in the Old Calabar Cross River region of modern Nigeria and Cameroon. What is more, African cabildos and matanzas were the organizational nuclei of the 1844 plantation uprisings known as La Conspiración de la Escalera, or the 1844 movement, where African descendants sought to abolish slavery, depose the colonial regime, and institute a government of African descendants on the island. Plasso resignified the masquerade so that the little devil, a much maligned character, prophesied retributions to befall slave society. Thank you.